People were super friendly. And so we'd go down there quite a bit. And so we got our meal, and they give you the fortune cookie with the bill. And I opened mine up that night, and it said this: "Your feet shall step on the soils of many lands." Now, I've not only been to Nigeria, I've been to Ghana and Togo and Cameroon, Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Malawi. I've been all over Europe. I've been to India, Nepal, Korea, Singapore. I've been to Central America, South America. My feet literally have stepped on the soils of many, many lands. Well, it wasn't too long after that, about a year or so, we were back down there. You're going to think, boy, this is over. We should have had Chinese food this weekend. But I was back at that same restaurant, and this time I got a fortune cookie, and I opened it up, and it said this: "God gives you one face, but you make for yourself another." God gives you one face, but you make for yourself another. The idea behind that is about character. It's talking about the character of an individual. Now, Norman Schwarzkopf once made this statement that leadership is the potent combination of strategy and character. And if you must be without one, be without strategy. He wasn't saying that strategy is unimportant, but what he was saying is that the bedrock foundation of your leadership is about character, the character of the individual. I've studied a lot about character over the years. It's a fascinating subject to me, and it's interesting how that when we think about people and their character, the one thing is that the choices you make in your life oftentimes determine your character. And at the same time, your character will determine the choices that you make in your life. And how many times have we known people on a professional level? It may be that it's a professional athlete, maybe an entertainer of some sort, a musician, maybe it's an actor or an actress. I mean, people in the limelight, the spotlight so much. And what happens is we look up to them, and then we read about, or we see in the news, or we see something that shows that in a moment of weakness, or maybe a moment of vulnerability, or just a moment of worldliness, they get involved in something and it destroys their character. And we no longer look at them the same way. Well, Christianity is no different. People are always watching us. And if they know that we're Christians, they watch even more closely. And if we're not careful in those times in our life, maybe it's a moment of anger, or maybe it's a moment of vulnerability, or maybe it's a moment of weakness or temptation, and we do something, and in that moment, it destroys our character. It's interesting to me, the Bible speaks a lot about character, but there's one particular passage that I want us to focus on that, to me, defines in the best way I know this idea of character and the type of character that we need to have as Christians. It's found in the book of Psalms. If you want to open up to Psalm 15, we're going to look primarily at verses 1 and 2. Psalm 15, verses 1 and 2. It's interesting that David here, as he writes this psalm, starts off by asking two questions. He starts off by saying, "O Lord, who may abide in your tent, and who may dwell on your holy hill?" Now, I know about enough Hebrew to really be dangerous, which means I don't know very much. But the interesting thing about the Hebrew language is a lot of times you have this situation where you have two phrases that are called a Hebrew parallelism. It's two ways of saying the same thing. And at first I used to think that's what this verse was doing. It was just two different ways of asking the same question. And then I did some research on it, and I got to noticing there are two different words that are used here. And they're very important words, because he says, "O Lord, who may abide in your tent." That word abide literally has to do with this idea of walking into something, walking into a place. And so he's saying, Lord, who is it that can walk into your presence? And then the second question which is who may dwell on your holy hill. That word dwell has to do with stay. It's not just going in, but it's staying. And so what David is asking is, who is it that has the kind of character that can walk into God's presence and stay in God's presence? And the answer to that question comes in verse 2. The one who walks with integrity, who works righteousness, and who speaks truth in their heart. I want us to focus for a few moments on these three words: integrity, righteousness, and truth. The idea of integrity, some translations will use the word upright, some use the word blameless, and the word that is integrity in the New American Standard is a word that we tend to use a lot today. And we think about integrity. I've asked people in the past, how do you define it? How would you define integrity? And I get a lot of different answers, but the one that really tends to stand out the most is this idea that it's doing the right thing when no one else is watching, even if it costs you something. Now, I think that's a pretty good definition. I tell people that my definition of integrity is called practicing the presence of God. Because if there are things that we would do, things that we would say, places we would go, activities that we would participate in, that we would not do, we would not say, we wouldn't go there, we wouldn't participate in them, if an elder were with us, or if our spouse were with us, or if the preacher were with us, then what we're doing is we're giving more respect to a man than we are to God, because God sees it all. You want to live a life of integrity? Practice the presence of God in your life. Now, the word that is translated integrity is mostly used in the book of Leviticus. And it's a word that is used in connection to the sacrifices that were made. They had to be whole, or they had to be complete. They had to be without defect or blameless, is the idea. And I think that's pretty fascinating to think about how that the one who can walk into God's presence and stay in God's presence is the individual who walks with this concept of integrity or completeness or wholeness. But then he says, he works righteousness. The Hebrew word that is translated righteousness, much like the Greek word in the New Testament that is translated righteousness, is also translated many times as justice. Now, the word justice is also a very significant word for us to think about, especially when we look at the Old Testament, because there's this element of God's justice that is found throughout the Old Testament. And the people of Israel were responsible for carrying out God's justice. But here's how that was done. It was about taking care of the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger in the land. They were instructed that when they harvested their fields, they were to leave the outer edges of those fields, and anything that fell off, they were to leave that for the poor, the orphan, the widow, and the stranger in the land. And when Israel did not fulfill God's justice in taking care of those less fortunate, He would punish them and lead them into captivity. Now, when I think about this idea of justice, I look to the Sermon on the Mount because this word righteousness is used a great deal in the Sermon on the Mount. But it kind of takes on a whole different meaning when we understand that who Jesus was teaching were Jews, and those Jews understood this concept of justice. And I want to quote a couple of those passages for you to think about. And I want you to notice not only the context with which it's said and the wording that's used around it, but to think about how it would apply in light of what we understand concerning justice in the Old Testament. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for justice, for they shall be satisfied. We get to the end of chapter 6, and Jesus is going to make this statement: seek first God's kingdom and His justice, and all these things will be added to you. Have you ever thought about why Jesus said, and His justice? I mean, wouldn't seeking first the kingdom of God encompass everything? Why did Jesus add this concept of "and His justice"? And think about it in light of the context. Why do you worry about what you're going to eat, or what you're going to drink, or what you're going to clothe yourselves with? The Gentiles seek after all these things, and your Father in heaven knows that you need them even before you ask. Seek first His kingdom and His justice. He'll see that you have all of these things. Now, in between these 2 points, in the very first verse of chapter 6, Jesus says, "Beware of practicing your justice before men in order to be noticed by them. Otherwise, you have no reward from your Father who is in heaven." In the very next verse, He talks about giving to the poor. Now, I may be totally wrong. That's a real possibility. It's going to be hard to prove to me that Jesus isn't trying to instruct these people and for us to understand that the idea of what He is teaching is the need for God's people, those who would be His disciples, those who would be the light of the world and the salt of the earth, that one of the greatest responsibilities that we have is to make sure we're taking care of people who are less fortunate than us. I mean, when you look at James, which is almost a mirror image of the Sermon on the Mount, James teaches us that pure religion and undefiled before God the Father is this: you take care of the orphan or the fatherless and the widows in their distress, and keep yourself unstained by the world. Who is it that can walk into God's presence and stay? Well, it's the individual who is going to walk with integrity, wholeness, completeness, and the one who works justice. Micah even raised the question, "What does the Lord require of you, O man? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God." And then there's this phrase, "He speaks truth in his heart." Now, I've often asked people, what do you think of when you think of truth? And a lot of times I'll get answers like, well, it's being honest, having honest speech. When people ask you questions or you're in conversation with people, you're being honest in what you say. That's truth. And I think there's probably some application to that. Sometimes people say, well, it's God's Word. Jesus tells us in John 17, sanctify them in the truth. God's Word is truth. And so I would understand that too, but that's not what really gets me here on this verse. Because he says he speaks truth in his heart. And I got to thinking, okay, Jesus said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. But that's not what David wrote. David said he speaks truth in his heart. That led me to start an investigation of what's going on here in verse 2 and the words that are being used. Now, I'll tell you, I've heard I don't know how many lessons in my lifetime on the idea of Psalm 15 and focusing on those 3 words, integrity, justice, and truth. And as I studied that text more, I'm beginning to see that while those are important words, they're not the 3 most important words for us to get from this text. The 3 most important words here are walks, works, and speaks. In the original language, those are known as noun-verb participles. What that means is they function as both a noun and a verb at the same time. And what David is trying to say, it's not just the person that does these things that can walk into God's presence and stay. It's about who they are on the inside. That's character. Character is not just about what an individual does, it's about who they are. There are a lot of people who go through the motions. They know how to do the right stuff, but their heart, as Jesus said, is far from me. They worship me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. So when I think about this idea of what David is trying to say here and emphasize to us about character, is much of what I thought. I remember my dad telling me when I was growing up, he said, you can fool some of the people some of the time. You might even fool a lot of the people a lot of the time. He said, but you can't fool everyone all of the time. And even if you could, you can't fool God, because God's looking at your heart. As I think about this verse and the idea of walks with integrity, works righteousness, and speaks truth in his heart, I tried to think of one word that really kind of sums up the whole of the character of the individual who can walk into God's presence and stay in God's presence. And the word that comes to my mind, and the one that I have focused on the most in my life, is this idea of being trustworthy. It's been long time ago, but several years ago when I was preaching full-time with the congregation in Greenbrier, Arkansas, I was asked one year to lead the prayer at the Chamber of Commerce banquet. It was their fundraising banquet. And the guest speaker that night was Houston Nutt. Now, Houston Nutt at that time was the head football coach for the Arkansas Razorback football program. That's how long ago this was. And so he got up to speak, and I started taking a few notes. And he said that every freshman that comes into the Razorback football program, they sit down with, and they emphasize to them that it is such a great privilege to be an Arkansas Razorback. No greater privilege in college sports and athletics than to be an Arkansas Razorback. And then he said, we ask each of them 3 questions. Number 1, can I trust you? Can I trust you to go to class? Can I trust you to do the work that the professors assign you? Can I trust you? He said the second question that we asked them is, are you committed? Are you committed to being an Arkansas Razorback? Are you committed to giving 100% of your effort on the field and off the field? Are you committed? When he asked the third question, I don't know what he said after that, because my mind started thinking sermon. I'm thinking I'm going to use this somewhere in a sermon for somebody. Because the third question was, do you care? In my mind, I thought, if you take a group of people that you can trust, and they are committed, and they care, you can change the world. I want to focus on the first question. Can I trust you? All of my life, I have heard sermons and classes about the need for us to put our complete and total trust in God. I know the verse, I memorized it years ago in Proverbs 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, He will make your path straight. I know what the Bible says about putting our trust in God, but that's not the question. Have you ever considered, can God trust you? Can He trust me? Paul wrote to the church at Corinth, and he said that we are stewards of the mysteries of God, and it is required of stewards that they be found trustworthy. Worthy of God's trust. Can God trust you and me? Can He trust us to be good students of His Word? Now, I'm never opposed to people reading the Bible through in a year. I think that's a great plan for those who can follow that. But for me, it's very challenging, because if I ever get a day behind, then I'm just trying to catch up, and I couldn't tell you after I finished reading it what I read before I started. I mean, it's just not a good plan for me. I have to do this thing where I read a passage over and over and over and over and over and over. And so what I tend to do is, like if I'm reading the Gospel of Luke, I'm going to read the Gospel of Luke for 6 months. Or if I'm reading 1 Peter, if I'm reading, Isaiah. Right now I'm currently reading Isaiah. And so I'm just trying to read it, and I'm going to read it again, and I just read it over and over and over, and trying to look for things that stand out. That's what helps me remember the text of what I'm reading as I read it over and over and over. But can God trust us to be good students? Not just to read the surface and not just to think about, oh, what's being said here, but to dig more deeply into it and to think about how it applies. Can He trust us to do that? Can God trust us to reach people who are outside of Christ with the gospel of Jesus? You know, He doesn't have any other plan. He's not going to appear to them in a dream. He's not going to stop their car in the middle of the road with a bright light. He's not going to do those things. You and I, we are the vessels that message has been placed into. You know, we sing that song, into our hands the gospel is given. Into our hands is given the light. Haste, let us carry God's precious message, leading the erring back to the right. I mean, can God trust us to lead those who are outside of Christ to know Him? Can God trust us to love His church? Now, I've only lived 62 years and a couple of months on this earth. But based on what I know from studying the Bible and from church history, the church has never been more divided than it is in the 21st century. And I'm telling you, I have experienced and I have seen people divide over some of the craziest things. Chairs or pews? Well, if you put chairs in, we're going liberal, I'm going somewhere else. We had one lady at a congregation that she was like, we're not putting chairs in here. And I'm like, why wouldn't you want chairs? She said, because if you lay a baby down on that, they can fall down the crack. I'm like, I don't know what chairs you're thinking about, but I've never seen chairs in a church building that you could lay a baby on and it would fall down the crack. But she was going to leave if we put chairs in. And I'm like, this is the craziest thing I've ever seen. What color should the carpet be? Should we have a metal lid? I know a church that divided when they took a cloth that they used to use to cover the fruit of the vine and covered it with a metal lid. Now, I realize those are a few examples, and there are many, many, many others where people have divided over some of the craziest things. And my question is, can God trust us to love His church? Jesus died for it. Can I not set aside my opinion about something that is trivial in order to keep unity among His people? Can God trust us to love His church? Can God trust us to make the right choices in our life? You know, in our lifetime, we're going to make millions and millions of choices. And most of those decisions are very inconsequential. You know, it doesn't take much for me to choose whether I'm going to shampoo my hair or just use soap. It's not much of a choice for me, and so it doesn't take long to make that decision. I usually don't take very long to decide whether I'm going to wear sweats or a suit. I mean, there are a lot of choices. It don't make any difference. But there are some choices that we make in our life that are extremely consequential. Who we marry, whether we have kids or not, where we live, our work, whether we decide to follow Jesus or not. Can God trust us to make the right choices in our life? Can God trust us to lead His church? I made reference over the weekend to the idea that when you think about churches of Christ in this country, 65% of them is the estimate that do not have elders. 65% do not have elders. In a market of somewhere around 12,000 congregations in this country, that's somewhere around 7,500 to 7,800 that do not have elders. That's a lot of churches. In addition to the fact that there are estimates that about 100 to 110 are closing their doors every year. I see it, I hear about it all the time. And I realize that there are some situations that cannot be helped. But generally speaking, one of the challenges that exists is the lack of leadership. In most congregations that I'm affiliated with, I only know of a few that are doing anything ongoing to prepare the next generation to lead. Can God trust us to lead His church? I could go on and on, but the question is so relevant for us to think about. I pray every day that the way I live my life would be worthy of God's trust in me and all He's entrusted to me. Can God trust us? The question that oftentimes I get asked is, how do you develop that kind of character? How do you develop a character that is worthy of God's trust? There are probably 100 answers to that question. I'm going to share two with you. One is what I call a character audit. Now, I thought the first time I came up with that, I thought, something new. I may write on this, a character audit. Like 2 days later, I got an article in the mail. It was on doing character audit. I thought, well, that didn't work. Nothing new under the sun. But the idea of a character audit is this. Each of us either have, and we know them, or we kind of unconsciously have them. But all of us have certain values in our life. We call them core values. These core values that exist in our life exist, and they're the type of values that we wouldn't change no matter what. And so a character audit is about looking back over the past week, maybe, or the past month, or maybe the past year, and honestly doing self-reflection to determine, are there things in my life that I have done, things that I've said, that do not align well with my core values? Because if that's the case, then the worst thing for us to do is to try to ignore it, hoping that it will go away, to deny it, or neglect it. What we need to do is change it. If there are things in our life that are inconsistent with our core values, then we need to change that so that our life aligns with those values that are a part of who we are. And Christian values are even more critical, that we are working to align our life with those things. The second part of this is really more practical in nature, and it really involves asking ourselves a very important question. About 10 years ago, maybe, I had a guy recommend a book to me by Susie Welch entitled The 10-10-10 Principle. And so I got the book in the mail, and I hadn't had a chance to read it yet. I just kind of looked at the Cliff Notes version of it, if you will. And I knew what the book was about from looking at that, but I hadn't had a chance to really dig into it. And then during this time, I got a phone call from this young couple that were having marital problems. And the wife had called, and I knew them both very, very well. And they asked, could you meet with us? And I was like, absolutely. So we met. I'm listening to her. I'm listening to him. There was no infidelity in the relationship. They just couldn't get along. They were fighting all the time, and he was tired of it. And so in his mind, they were headed for divorce. And so I asked her, after listening to them go back and forth, I said, can you just give me a moment alone with him so that we can talk? And so she left the room, and I started talking to him. And in my mind, what popped in my mind was this book that I had just received, the 10-10-10 Principle. And so I asked him, I said, I'm listening to you. I think I kind of get what you're talking about. I said, I just want to ask you a couple of questions. I said, can you live with the decision that you're about to make 10 minutes from now? Can you live with it 10 months from now? And can you live with it 10 years from now? I said, I know you pretty well, and I said, I think you're mad enough that you would have no problem saying, I can live with this decision 10 minutes from now. And I said, you're probably mad enough that you'd have no problem saying, I can live with it 10 months from now. I said, but can you live with it 10 years from now? He broke down and began to cry, and he said, you're right. He said, I am mad. And he said, I can live with it 10 minutes from now. And I'm probably mad enough that 10 months wouldn't be a problem either. He said, but I don't want to be alone in 10 years. I said, then what do we need to do to fix it? What do you need in order to correct this thing? So he kind of laid out what he wanted to happen. So I called her back in the room and I said, okay, here's the deal. If you want to keep this marriage together, here's what we're going to need to do. This is the plan. She agreed to it. And I'm glad to say that now, 10 plus years later, they are still married. They have 2 beautiful children, and he serves as a deacon in the church. And it was all based upon just kind of that simple question of, can I live with this decision 10 minutes from now, 10 months from now, and 10 years from now? Obviously, it's not literally 10 minutes, 10 months, 10 years. It's about the short term, mid-range term, and long term. But in my mind, I think, okay, when we're talking about developing the kind of character that can walk into God's presence and stay in God's presence, when we face those times in our life, maybe where we're dealing with a temptation, maybe it's a moment where we're vulnerable, maybe it's a moment of anger, maybe it's something of that nature. Whatever it is, if we could just stop and think, can I live with what I'm about to say? Can I live with what I'm about to do 10 minutes from now? Can I live with it 10 months from now? And do I still want to live with this 10 years from now? It might, if we would stop and do that, it might change the direction of how we approach the things that we say and the things that we do. Because when it all comes down to the type of character that we want, the type of character that is worthy of God's trust, the type of character that can walk into God's presence and stay in God's presence, it really does come down to the decisions that we make in our life. Because oftentimes the decisions that we make determine our character. And our character will determine the decisions that we make. So what kind of character do you have? What kind of character do you want? Now, I don't know if we're having an invitation tonight or not. I'm assuming that this is an opportunity for you to do this. And really, you know, there's a part of me that I love this idea of saying, hey, if you got something great to share, share it. I think we should do that all the time. And maybe that's something you want to do, is share something of praise and noteworthy. Maybe it's you want something to be prayed with you. I don't know. I don't know the needs of your heart because I don't know your heart. But here's what I'm asking you to do. When we finish up tonight and you walk out and you get in your cars and you start heading home, I want you to do and be honest enough to self-reflect in your life and just ask yourself, do I have the kind of character that is worthy of God's trust? And if the answer to that question is no, then all I'm asking you to do is make the changes necessary to do so. Because it'll be the greatest choice you will ever make that will define your character from now on. And if there is a need in your life that you would like us to pray about to help you get your character back on track where it needs to be, then I hope that you'd be willing to allow us to pray together for you and with you to help you do those things that would truly allow you to not only walk into God's presence, but to stay in God's presence. And if we can do that for you, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.